Okay. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Abbott, I would like to welcome you all for this interesting webinar series titled as Turning the Tide. So, we all know that in recent days, managing ICU cases is not an easy task. Definitely, whenever we have antimicrobial resistant cases, it becomes really our patient's outcome. So, in this regard, we thought, why don't we approach our experts and learn from them? So, in order to do that, it will be helpful if they provide us with some of the case examples. So, this webinar series will be based on a discussion that is revolving around some of the complicated cases in ICU. So, with this brief background, I would like to welcome you all for this Turning the Tide web series on complicated cases in ICU. So, to enlighten us today, we have a very eminent speakers and moderator with us today. So, I would like to welcome Dr. Rajlakshmi A, who is a consultant infectious diseases and group coordinator infection control at KIMS Hospital, Trivandrum, India. So, Madam, I welcome you and I request you to take this meeting forward and discuss the complicated cases in the ICU and guide us in managing them in a better way. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Kiran. It's my pleasure to start the meet, and today's topic is a very, very interesting one in the context of COVID. And we all know that last year we were talking about a lot of gram-negative infections, and from 2020 we are attacked by COVID, and COVID has resulted in many innumerable publications as well as a lot of discussions and talk. So for a change, we have today a very interesting clinical scenario as well as what is new in the scenario of aspergillosis. Especially aspergillosis can be critical. I mean, we usually find in immunocompromised, it's more and more seen in ICU in non-immunocompromised individuals or so-called soft, it's not a hem-onc patients or solid organ transplant, even otherwise, those who are partially, or I should say, it should not neutropenic patients, non-neutropenic patients also, we see more and more cases. So in this context, I will introduce two speakers today, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jindal, Dr. Apar Jindal, who is a clinical director, lung transplant, interventional pulmonology, and chest medicine in MGM Healthcare, Chennai. And he is an expert, and they have done a very good number of heart and lung transplants, as well as today he will be sharing his experience on invasive aspergillosis that he has come across. The second speaker is Dr. Yuvarajan, who is a consultant pulmonologist and in critical care and sleep medicine. He holds MD, DNB and FCCP, as well as European Diploma in Adult Respiratory Medicine. He is a consultant in Sri Manakula Vinayagar Medical College and Hospital, Pondicherry, India. He will be also presenting a very, very interesting and rare cases of invasive aspergillosis, which we'll be listening to them in a few minutes. And the most important aspect in this discussion is the clinical scenarios will be interspersed with poll questions, which will be directed to the audience and will be discussed so that to make this whole program lively. And as you know, rather than any clinical presentation or lectures, clinical cases is the most interesting, and it makes the audience our listeners very much interested into the program. So today we'll have two interesting cases, and before I start, I'll just roll out how aspergillosis has treatment and diagnosis have evolved over the last few years, and what we have in the current scenario of COVID. Just a few slides so that the next two speakers can take and present their interesting cases. So I'll go to my brief presentation, which will be just an overall overview of aspergillosis, as well as an update about what we have currently. Are you able to see my slides?
No, we are not able to see your slides.
Yeah, can you now?
Not yet. Might be just coming. It's not yet coming. You can just open the presentation in another window and scroll down and just click on the slide share, and you can just go to the application window and click over there.
Rajlakshmi ma'am, can you hear me? Hello, Rajlakshmi ma'am.
I think she is just working on that slide to share.
Yeah.
Okay, no worries, sir.
Yeah. You can just make it full screen. You can just make it full screen.
Okay.
That's
So,
perfect. Can you please switch on your video, ma'am?
yes.
Yeah. The slides, yeah. Of course. Yeah, you can just make it full screen, ma'am. Perfect. You can just make it full screen.
Okay.
Perfect. Perfect.
So, this is just a short, brief summary about aspergillosis and an update about the drugs. So, what are the syndromes that we usually come across in aspergillosis? So, aspergillus can be a saprophytic fungi just laying around, and then it may not be pathogenic or invasive. It can cause allergic syndromes, which we commonly see as ADPA. It can cause invasive syndromes, which could be pulmonary or extrapulmonary. So the syndromes, as I said, it could be colonization, just lying there, because it is ubiquitous in our environment. Second common syndrome that we find is fungal ball due to aspergillus, which is usually a thing that we find in a lung cavity, which could be a tuberculous cavity usually. Third is allergic response to aspergillus, as I said, ADPA. And the most important thing is the semi-invasive or invasive infections, which we usually come across in immunocompromised individuals, which can be a chronic necrotizing pneumonia or an invasive pulmonary aspergillosis, which is what we commonly seen in transplant or heme population. Looking at the extrapulmonary invasive aspergillosis, it can affect most of the organism, any organism, just like TB. And commonly we find abscesses in CNS or meningitis. It can be an invasive infection of the sinus, which can even affect the brain. Can present as endophthalmitis, peritonitis, hepatic and GI infections, especially in neutropenic, endocarditis, pericarditis, pleural disease. Renal aspergillosis has been reported. Can also present as osteomyelitis, spondylodiscitis, which can mimic as TB, septic arthritis, and it can involve ear and skin. Looking at the at-risk population for invasive aspergillosis, the most important risk factor is prolonged neutropenia, or a group called HSCT, that is hem-onc population post stem cell transplant, advanced HIV with very severe T cell deficiency, and inherited immunodeficiency. These are the classical at-risk population. But we should look at also expanded risk groups, which we all mostly see in the critical care ICUs. These patients are not neutropenic, and these patients also have, to some extent, CD4 deficiency. These are chronic liver disease, COPD, those receiving prolonged course of steroids, transfusion-associated hemosiderosis, and diabetes mellitus. So I'll just give a brief update about a therapy part from the IDSA 2016 update guidelines on aspergillosis. So what does it say? How can a diagnosis of invasive aspergillosis be established? What we need is tissue or fluid specimen. This should be a sterile specimen to be submitted for adequate quantities for simultaneous histopathologic as well as cytologic and culture examination. PCR is not well validated for aspergillosis, but it can be tried in some cases, especially in neutropenic individuals. And the microbiological aspect is based on the growth in the subarachnoid agar medium, SDA, subarachnoid dextrose agar medium. As you can see, it can be in the plate or in a broth, which is easily culturable. And you look at the smear under the LPCB medium to look at the aspergillus spores. And this is the HPE, where you may find that there may be fragments of aspergillus hyphae, and based on the septate as well as branching, it is being differentiated from mucor, and aspergillus will have septate hyphae and branching at acute angles. What is the role of galactomannan, and how can it be used in diagnosis of aspergillosis? So galactomannan can be done in serum and bile, and it is also done in many other tissues like CSF, but it is not very well validated. And it is an accurate marker for diagnosis of invasive aspergillosis in a specific population, and this population is hem-onc population. It can also be applied in bronchoscopy specimens from those patients, and we have strong recommendation and high quality evidence for these two. It is not recommended for screening solid organ transplant recipients or patients with CGD, where it is not very well validated. What about beta-D-glucan? These are serum assays, and it is recommended. It can be used for invasive aspergillosis, but it is not specific for aspergillus. That is the point. So if you find it positive, it can be due to several other fungal infections, including Candida and PCP. So if you compare the three assays of diagnosis of IE, what do you find? That sensitivity of galactomannan, beta-D-glucan, and PCR. As I said, in galactomannan, if your host is a neutropenic, you have a better specificity, because the neutrophils usually clear the galactomannan. So in neutropenic, it is very useful. The sensitivity in BAL is better. It goes up to 85, specificity up to 90. Beta-D-glucan is not very specific for, it is not specific for aspergillosis. Invasive aspergillosis can be seen in Candida as well. And the sensitivity is low. PCR is not validated, though the sensitivity ranges up to, in BAL specimens up to 80, and in blood around 88. So how it should be treated? The drug of choice still is voriconazole. Alternative therapy include liposomal amphotericin, isovaconazole, and other lipid formulations. So combination of voriconazole echinocandin may be considered in select patients who have documented IPA. It is a weak recommendation and moderate quality of evidence. Primary therapy with echinocandin is not recommended, and echinocandin can be used in setting where azole and Pauline antifungals are contraindicated, like voriconazole and amphotericin are contraindicated. Duration of aspergillosis is minimum of 6 to 12 weeks, but it depends on the host immunosuppression, the site of the disease, and disease involvement. Aspergillus causing endocarditis and brain abscesses, the therapy is usually for months to up to a year. For patients with successfully treated IPA who require subsequent immunosuppression, secondary prophylaxis should be initiated to prevent recurrence. So this voriconazole is given at a dose of 6 mg per kg, 12 hourly for 1 day, followed by 4 mg per kg, Q12 hourly. Oral therapy can also be given. Let us look at the problems with ORI. ORI is formulated as tablets as well as IV formulation, and IV formulation contain the cyclodextrin. So cyclodextrin and voriconazole dissociate in plasma when you infuse, and this cyclodextrin is renally excreted, accumulation of which can be harmful and can cause renal insufficiency. And voriconazole is a stimulant of CYP3A4 and inhibitor of CYP2C19. So what is the problem with this? It can have a erratic PK/PD, and not only that, patient age, liver function, and other medications and diet and antacids have a role to play in voriconazole drug levels in the blood. Reduced ORI levels may be observed in oral administration of the drug or co-administration with rifampicin, which is a CYP inducer, or phenytoin. And in all these cases, or even otherwise, even if they are not having any other drug which will interact with voriconazole, serum levels measurement is advised. We have a lot of adverse effects with ORI, as you know. It can cause transient visual disturbance. This character is called as photopsia, but it's not an indication to stop the drug. Many people overcome over a period of time of a week or so. Can be hepatotoxic, can cause skin rash, erythroderma, photosensitivity. It can cause GI disturbance. But what is most important is you have to watch for QTC prolongation and tachyarrhythmias. It can cause reversible central and peripheral neurological symptoms and hallucinations. Prolonged ORI therapy can result in toxicities like periostitis and severe pain in joints. It can also increase the risk of squamous cell carcinoma if it is prolonged use, especially with concomitant immunosuppression. POSA is recently introduced few years ago. It is available as an oral suspension. It is available as delayed release tablet and IV formulation. So the only problem with suspension is it is not absorbed well. Oral availability is bioavailability is very erratic. And now we have the IV formulation. But remember, it also has cyclodextrin. It is a preparation containing cyclodextrin. It also can induce a CYP3A4 isoenzyme. And again, the tedium needs to be monitored even if the patient is on POSA, just like voriconazole. It can prolong the QTC. So you have to be very careful if you combine with levoflox or azithromycin, which can also prolong the QTC. Drug interaction is very, very important if you use any of the azoles for that matter. Isavuconazole was approved by FDA in 2015 for use in invasive aspergillosis. It is based on this trial where they found in a phase 3 non-inferiority trial that involved 527 patients, where they compared isavuconazole with VORI, and they found that all-cause mortality through day 42 was 19% isavo was compared to 20, which is comparable. Drug-related side effects was less with isavo. They reported that 42% of people receiving isavuconazole and 60% receiving voriconazole reported adverse effects. And if you split what are the adverse effects that noticed, hepatobiliary disorders was 9 in isavo, 16 higher in VORI. Eye disorders, eye disturbance were more in VORI as compared to isavuconazole. Even skin-related disorders were more in VORI. VORI is actually longer half-life. It has a half-life of 5 days, and the IV formulation does not contain cyclodextrin. But what we usually use is oral preparation, and it also requires a loading dose. First 2 days is loading dose, and similar toxicity profile as compared to VORI. Drug interaction is less severe than VORI. That is a good thing. And most importantly, when compared to VORI and POSA, isavuconazole shortened the QTC interval. So that is to be remembered. And not much of drug interaction because it is not as an enzyme inducer compared to the other two. My last few slides. So the latest is COVID-19 associated pulmonary aspergillosis. This is called CAPA. So as we see COVID more and more, and as we see that more and more steroids are being used and more tocilizumab is being used, we may come across this not rarely, but maybe more frequently than rare. So severe COVID-19 results in both pulmonary epithelial damage and inflammation. Both these predispose to risk factors of invasive pulmonary aspergillosis, because we may be colonized with aspergillus in our bronchial epithelium. And diagnosis PAPA remains a challenge because we won't be doing well in most of these patients who have COVID. And there are other risk factors which may predispose to COVID. These are the increased levels of IL-6 as such can in fact impact the immune cell function, and they predispose to viral and bacterial fungal infections, and the use of TOSI, which paradoxically suppress and also predispose to kappa. So we need some clinical algorithm because we may not be doing bronch in most of them, and we'll have to have a via media where we can diagnose these form of aspergillosis, and these are called putative invasive pulmonary aspergillosis. So definitive invasive pulmonary aspergillosis needs histopathology or culture of lung tissue, or from a specimen from a normally sterile site, a positive culture. For colonization, what is needed is if colonization is if more than one criteria necessary for diagnosis of putative invasive pulmonary aspergillosis is not met, then you classify under aspergillus colonization. So PIPA, that is putative invasive pulmonary aspergillosis, comes in between these two. And what is the criteria for that? Aspergillosis should be positive in respiratory tract culture with a compatible sign and symptom, which can be a fever refractory to at least 3 days of appropriate antibiotic therapy. Recrudescent fever after 48 hours, effervescence while on antibiotics. There is new fever, pleuratic rub or chest pain or dyspnea or hemoptysis, and worsening respiratory insufficiency despite appropriate antibiotic. And then third important point is an imaging by chest X-ray or CT, which is compatible with aspergillosis. And fourth would be host risk factors, which can be any one of the following, not all are needed: neutropenia, underlying malignancy, glucocorticoid therapy, which we usually use for COVID, congenital acquired immune deficiency, and 4B is semi-quantitative aspergillus culture of bowel fluid without bacterial growth, together with a positive hyphae or direct microscopy. So to summarize, PIPA should have compatible signs and a radiological feature and a host factor or bowel positive culture for aspergillosis. So we may have to be aware of this condition, as we may find more and more following treatment of COVID. The sensitivity of application of this PIPA criteria in diagnosis, which will help in management or empiric therapy of a probable aspergillus, would be specificity of 61% and sensitivity of 92%. With this, I will stop my presentation, and I will now give the I will now ask our presenters to carry on with their cases. The first case . So, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. So can I ask the next presenter, Dr. Appajindal, to go ahead with this case presentation, and then we can take the poll questions in between and go on to the next case. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rajalakshmi. That was such a beautiful and composite review for aspergillosis. It was a good learning, good review for all the various forms, and especially the new entity kappa that we've come across. Truly, it's such a great hindrance right now, having to deal with COVID and then having to deal with all the non-COVID infections that are being missed. And it's definitely not an easy scenario to diagnose. I'm sure all the infectious diseases specialists across the country are being kept busy with this. So with that, I think let's move on to the case that I have. Let me just try to share the screen here. Can you see the slides? Are my slides visible?
Yeah, it's visible.
All right. So basically, there's no suspense here. Nobody gets brownie points for making a diagnosis. The diagnosis is right there on the title over here. It's just a case of invasive aspergillosis, an interesting case that we came across. The main points that I'm trying to put across when we are discussing this case is how to go about a case of aspergillosis. how to have a high index of suspicion, what are the host factors that you need to consider, how to take one step at a time to work these cases up to achieve, arrive at a good diagnostic algorithm and make an appropriate diagnosis. And then we'll spend some time on the therapy portion of it, and then finally move on to a few slides, just maybe 3 or 4 slides on a review of literature regarding invasive aspergillosis in a very special setting. And given my area of expertise, my area of interest, and my area of work, of course, the setting is going to be the setting of lung transplantation. So let's move on to the case, having said that. So this is a 64-year-old female who underwent a bilateral lung transplant about a year back and presented with cough and worsening dyspnea for 1 month duration. Mind it, 1 month duration. She presented with just 1 episode of hemoptysis on the day of presentation, was febrile with a temperature of 101.4 degrees Fahrenheit. She was normotensive and room air saturation was about 97%. On auscultation, she had diffuse expiratory wheezes and scattered crackles. She was currently on tacrolimus, mycophenolate sodium, and prednisolone for her immunosuppressive therapy. So with this, I'd like to open the stage with the first poll question here, that what do you think is the differential diagnosis just at that point of time? Are we dealing with a community-acquired pneumonia? Are we dealing with a case of tuberculosis post-transplant? Are we dealing with an acute rejection? And mind you, at 1 year, acute rejections are fairly common as well. Is it a fungal pneumonia? Can we just go ahead and stab it and say that this is a fungal pneumonia that we may be dealing with? Or similarly, can we break it down into a viral pneumonia? So technical team, is it out for the poll? But technical team, how much time do we give for the poll, and is the question already out for the poll?
Hello, sir, just a few seconds, just a matter of few seconds, the result would get launched. And I guess so they have been, yes, the results are there with us. So around majority of the audience have voted for community acquired pneumonia, as in 75%, followed by 25% of them have voted for fungal pneumonia, and none of them have takes for the acute rejection and the viral pneumonia or the TB. So majority of them have gone for the community acquired pneumonia as the choice.
So very interesting, and I think this is one of the most difficult questions that I have included into my slide set, and I'm so sorry, sir, to bring in the most difficult question right at the beginning. You see, when we are dealing with this particular setting, it is a post-transplant scenario. It's an elderly lady who's in a 1 year post-transplant status and on massive doses of immunosuppression. She's on tacrolimus, she's on mycophenolate full dose, and she's also on a dose of steroid. Actually speaking, all of them could be the possible differential diagnosis. To start with, you have to deal with all of them. Let's try to see them one by one. And is it possible to bring in Dr. Rajalakshmi and Dr. Yuvarajan into the discussion at this point of time? Team? Probably.
Hi.
So,
Yeah.
okay, good. So would you like to take a stab at it, ma'am? And would you like to add something there?
I heard that the symptoms of 1 month duration. Am I right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So for me, it is a post-transplant in a T-cell suppressed host, and the pneumonia is of 1 month duration, and the X-ray is showing nodular opacities on the right side. So for me, it is a chronic pneumonia syndrome, chronic nodular pneumonia syndrome, post-transplant in a T-cell suppressed host. So acute pneumonias are out. Acute bacterial pneumonias are mostly out, except for quite a few, like melioidosis, and if it is necrotizing pneumonia, quite a few mostly are out. So I will think about chronic pneumonia syndromes, and again, viral pneumonia will not be will be the least likely among them because it's 1 month duration. So
exactly.
From infection aspect, I would consider tuberculosis, which is always common in India. And I would also like to know what was his immune status or IGRA, or if it is done, and about the we won't know about we won't know about the donor aspect. So at least a recipient, what is the IGRA status, I would be happy to know. Second is possibility would be a fungal pneumonia. And third, rejection. I don't know whether rejection will present like this of nodular pneumonia. So the picture, I don't think it fits in, but probably you can enlighten us more. But viral pneumonia is unlikely. CAP, if it is a community-acquired pneumonia, then it is a slowly evolving bacterial pneumonia, which can be due to melioidosis, which can occur if he is not very careful with his outdoor exposure and so on. But topmost are TB, fungal pneumonia, and rest is all less likely, I would say.
So I think you've answered it better than anybody else, better than I could have even explained it. So very rightly said, unlikely to be CAP, unlikely to be viral pneumonia, just given the time duration of 1 month for the presentation of symptoms. Now let's rule out or rule in between TB, acute rejection, and fungal pneumonias. So the key factor over here is post-transplantation. Any presentation can be treated as acute rejection. So we always have to keep acute rejections into the mix over here. And of course, tuberculosis, given the Indian circumstance, you have to think about it, and fungal pneumonias also, especially when you're talking about 1 year duration, you post-transplant, you have to think about fungal pneumonias, because typically by then the post-fungal prophylaxis has usually been tapered off. So just a little bit review that we will do over here, and I'm not going to give out the answer yet because we all know what the case is. So just a review in this slides, the graph on the left where we are looking at the ISHLT, or the International Society for Heart and Lung data on what are the common complications post-transplant. You can very clearly see that when we are looking at this duration, when we are looking at about 1 year duration, the most common complication that we see is infection, and graft failure or acute rejections is becoming less. And definitely the other forms of complications such as chronic rejections or BOS, malignancies, and cardiovascular complications is still not hit the picture in a big way. So most commonly what we are dealing at this point of time would be infections. And if you move on to the graph on the picture, the cartoon on the right hand side, between bacterial infections, fungal infections, and viral infections, you can, I'm so sorry about that. You can clearly see that in the early period, though fungal infections and bacterial infections are common, but when we hit about 12 months post-transplant, all the infections can be equally incriminating. Viruses like CMV, HSV, or fungus like Aspergillus or Candida, or even Mucor at that point of time, or any of the bacteria. You can see that all of the bacteria can be incriminated over here. So we have to very carefully look at the presentation. We have to very carefully look at the time duration of the appearance of symptoms, and then take a stab at what we are dealing with. Are we dealing with a rejection or an infection, and what sort of infection if we are dealing with if we are thinking about an infection. So let's move on from there. We worked up the case further. The routine labs showed a TLC of 9500 with 98.3% neutrophils. Biochemical workup was more or less fairly okay. ABG showed some degree of hypoxemia. CMV PCR was negative, and HRCT showed this picture where there are multiple nodules with a halo sign. So with this, I would like to ask the second question over here, and you can see I've given some data, some information as to what these different signs are. But what is the sign which is commonly seen with invasive pulmonary aspergillosis? Are we looking at a halo sign? Are we looking at an air crescent sign? Are we looking at a bulging fissure sign? Or are we looking at a Monod sign? And then while the poll is going on, I would really like Yuvarajan, if he can share some words about each of these.
Yeah, that was the initial poll. The way that you put the poll was very interesting, because the timing is very important for a patient, particularly solid organ transplant. The timing is very important. That the points were nicely explained. After 12 months, all the possibilities are there. And regarding this poll on invasive pulmonary aspergillosis, there are two specific signs are there. One is the halo sign. Already you just shown the CT. That is a nodule surrounded by a ground glassing. That is called halo. That's halo around a nodule. So this ground glass is because of the bleeding. It is because the bleeding from the nodule, that is the ground glass is there. So it depends upon the timing when the patient presents to you and when you are taking the CT. Because when the patient initially comes to you, they will present with a organized form of the minimal patch along with the ground glass. Then they will form a nodule. Then after that, the nodule will break up because of necrosis. When the nodule breaks up because of necrosis, that is the time you will see the air crescent sign. That air crescent is because of the break of nodule because of necrosis that is there. So in the initial week, if you are taking a CT, you may have a chance that the patient may have a halo sign. In the second week, or maybe after 7 days or after 10 days, if you take a CT, you will have a air crescent sign. And the timing, based on the timing, it differs. And this monad sign and all, actually, that monad sign is actually a misnomer. Like, monad sign was actually described in aspergilloma. Just slightly different from what we are dealing now. So air crescent sign is conventionally described in CT for invasive aspergillosis when you do a CT at the late. Monad sign is usually the same thing like air crescent only, but this nodule is actually a saprophytic growth of fungus. Actually, that is actually a chronic form. That's totally different. Okay. And regarding bulging fissure sign, it's not very specific for invasive aspergillosis. It is the usual description is that in case of Klebsiella pneumonia, usually because of the weight of the lung, because of the consolidation, it pushes the fissure down. That's a classical sign in that. So I don't think among these two signs they have to select halos and air crescent sign. They have to select.
Absolutely. So, team is the results in.
Yeah. So, sir, as Dr. Yuvarajan sir also said, so audience, I think they have heard him. So majority of them have polled for this halo sign, 67% of them, and around 33% have shared their poll for bulging fissure sign, but none of them have voted for air crescent and monad sign. So majority of the audience have voted for halo sign.
So I think we have a good learned audience over here. They've done their homework, and they've come prepared with the knowledge of aspergillosis. I think we have a difficult time ahead between presenting
yes, true.
Learn larger things, but we'll try our best. So let's move on with the case over here. So as the audience has also very rightly guessed, and I think you've already explained beautifully, this is the halo sign. So just a small review on what are the different radiological presentations that we see with invasive aspergillosis. And mind you, I'm talking only and only about invasive aspergillosis over here. I'm not taking into account, when I'm talking about the radiology, of the other spectrum of the aspergillus diseases. I'm not including aspergilloma over here, and I'm not including the chronic forms of aspergillosis over here. So when we talk about invasive aspergillosis, we see, as you can see in picture A and B, airway thickening. We can see peribronchial consolidations. We can see nodules with surrounding ground glass opacity, which, as now Dr. Yuvarajan has already explained, this is because of a solid area of consolidation in the center, which is surrounded by leaky tissues or bleeding, hemorrhage around that consolidation, giving the halo appearance. In pictures C and D, you can see clearly the halo sign, which is demarcated, and E is showing a mass-like lesion, which can also be an initial presentation in cases of invasive aspergillosis. So going on to the next question over here, what would be the next best step in the management? For this patient, would you now like to do a PET scan? Would you like to do a bronchoscopy with a BAL? Would you go ahead on the bronchoscopy, add a TBLB, a transbronchial lung biopsy with a BAL? Or would you just rightly go for a pulse steroid trial, thinking that no, this still could be acute cellular rejection, and take it from there?
So
yeah, Yuvraj, let's see what you have to recommend for this.
Nothing. See, what was the PO2 like? The patient is really hypoxemic, or how is the clinical profile of the patient?
Hypoxemia. It was not very. He was not very hypoxemic.
Okay, he was not very hypoxemic, means we have a chance to confirm the diagnosis, as already Dr. Rajalakshmi Madam has explained, that we need to prove the invasive nature of aspergillosis either with microscopy, and the second thing is tissue invasion. Most of the times tissue invasion, to prove it, we need a biopsy to confirm that. How to take a biopsy in a patient who's already moribund? If the patient is hypoxemic, we can't do a bronchoscopy and do a biopsy. It's very difficult because patient cannot tolerate the procedure, practically speaking. So we have an option of putting a needle under CT guidance or putting a biopsy set under CT guidance. It's a good option. The nodule is more peripheral and all. But even that also is somewhat risky, because if it is not needed, you don't have to do a heroic procedure, because sometimes what will happen, this nodule may be close to, this nodule is always close to a vascularity. A vessel will be there close to the nodule. That is very classical of this invasive pulmonary aspergillosis. And in your case, it is a post-transplant. Most of the times, the vessel will be accompanying. It is not for immunocompetent. So when you short it, the chance of bleeding is just very high. So you have to just judge it. In my opinion, if the patient is not that much hypoxemic, you can go ahead with bronchoscopy with the ball, if possible, confirmation with the TBLB. If the patient is okay, we can do TBLB. Nothing is going to happen. So he can tolerate the procedure. We can do that.
Let me bring in the IT specialist. Let me ask Dr. Rajalakshmi what she would like to do. Would you want to do a biopsy here or not? Or would you think a BAL will be okay?
So we just have to apply the criteria whether we want a definitive diagnosis of invasive or a PFA. So this patient host is good. Host is a transplant host, the correct set or the correct host to develop an IA, even especially after stopping the prophylaxis or invasive aspergillus prophylaxis, everything, that stage is over, 6 months is over. So he is ideal candidate. So the option would be a BAL, and in the BAL, do a galactomannan, which is very well validated, in addition to fungal culture. Second option will be a a lung biopsy, either a transthoracic or a transbronchial lung biopsy based on where the location of the nodule is. So among this, I would even be, if it is not peripheral, I would be happy with a BAL, because the CT feature is very classical, the host is classical, and the BAL galactomannan, if it is above the cutoff, I'll be happy. But if a possible peripheral nodule is possible for a biopsy, especially if TB is in the back of the mind, and if IGRA is positive, I would go ahead with the biopsy. So
I think everybody is in agreement over here that we should go ahead with the bronchoscopy, do a BAL, and if conditions favor, then do a biopsy also. So let's see.
Yeah. So, sir, we just received the responses. So half of their audience have shared their responses for bronchoscopy with BAL and TBLB, and the response is fragmented with bronchoscopy with BAL and PET scan. But none of them have text for the trial of pulse steroid with acute cellular rejection. So half of the audience have voted for bronchoscopy with BAL and TBLB.
Excellent. So I think everybody is in agreement with everybody that we should go ahead, do a BAL, and then if required, if the conditions permit, also do a TBLB over here. So what we did was we did a bronchoscopy. We found that most of the tracheobronchiality was normal, but the mucosa, as you can also see, had areas of edema and erythema over there. Now, very characteristically, you can see this white coating. This is in the perianasmotic tissue. So what we are looking at is the right main bronchus, just in beyond the anastomosis. And if my arrow I can point out, you can see there is sort of a demarcation zone over here, because this is a 1 year post-transplant case. You cannot see the sutures, they've been absorbed. So this is the area of demarcation where the recipient and the donor bronchus meet. So this, what you can see, the white debris over here, this is what you would call as an aspergillus tracheobronchitis. So what we are dealing over here is now two sets of conditions. We saw there are nodules on the CT. There is a halo sign on the CT. So we are thinking about an invasive aspergillosis there. And also you can see there is a second presentation of aspergillus invasion that we can see over here, which is either called as a local colonization, or you can call it as an aspergillus tracheobronchitis. Now, this tracheobronchitis actually can present as accumulation of debris like this. It can at times present as a film, or it can just present as a colonizer. You can see white specks thrown randomly present across the mucosa. So when we are doing the bronchoscopy, it is very important to look at the mucosa, to inspect the mucosa and pick up these spots also, not just to go in quickly, gather the samples and come out. So a BAL was taken, a TBLB was done in this case, and the BAL was actually positive for Aspergillus fumigatus. So going on to the next question. Now, what biomarker would you like to do in this case? Would you like to do a beta-D-glucan? Would you like to do galactomannan? Would you like to do both of them? Or you think that the biomarker is not required? So let me bring Dr. Jayalakshmi back over here for that.
Okay. So we had earlier discussed that for Aspergillus, we have biomarkers which are galactomannan, beta-D-glucan. And when compared to beta-D-glucan, galactomannan is more sensitive and specific for Aspergillus. And there is widely validated, especially for BAL sample. And for this patient, the biomarker that can be used for IPA is obviously galactomannan. And beta-D-glucan is usually done in serum. It cannot be done in BAL. It is not validated. The sample that is done is serum. So I would go ahead with BAL galactomannan. And
so let me add to the question over here. Now, would you like to also do galactomannan in both the serum and the BAL, or do you think just the BAL galactomannan would be fine? Agreed, taking the point that beta-D-glucan should be done in the serum, but what about galactomannan there?
So galactomannan can be done in serum, but then it is validated for neutropenic host. And so it's usually seen in use in leukemic patients who has ANC is low or induction chemo, or in post stem cell transplant patients who are neutropenic. Because this neutrophil usually they destroy the galactomannan, so it's not validated or cannot be used in non-neutropenic patients. So here, this patient is post solid organ transplant. Transplant, and he's not neutropenic, so he's not an ideal candidate for serum galactomannan. So BAL galactomannan alone would do to diagnose this case.
I think that is a very important point that you brought up, that the neutropenic status has to be evaluated before we start doing serum galactomannan over here. So now the point was to differentiate whether we are dealing with what sort of invasive pulmonary aspergillosis are we dealing with to arrive at a final diagnosis. So there is a small diagnostic algorithm which has been given.
So, just sorry to intervene, Dr. Jindal sir. We got the audience response for this. And 45% of the audience have said galactomannan as in their choice, followed by another 45% as all of the above, that is beta-D-glucan as well as galactomannan. 9% of them are saying beta-D-glucan as in their choice, but none of them, I think the audience is again, as you said, smartly intelligent, none of them is saying none of the above as in their choice.
We are dealing with a audience over here. We have to, it's such a great thing to have an audience which is already so well read. So taking it further, so this is the diagnostic algorithm which has been put out. What we need to follow is, once the CT scan is done, mostly when we are dealing with fungal pneumonias, the chest radiographs, here fortunately we saw some nodular involvement, but the chest radiographs may fail to pick up these opacities. When you see them on the CT scan, they usually appear as focal infiltrates or as nodules. And then we need to see, with the further workup, is there a sputum culture for bacteria and fungi? Is the serum galactomannan we have to do? The serum beta-D-glucan assay we have to do. And we can, at this point of time, if we are fairly sure clinically that we are dealing with an Aspergillus infection, we can consider empirical voriconazole therapy. Now, when we order these tests, the beta-D-glucan and the galactomannan, let's see how the things would differentiate between the different combinations. If you have a positive sputum culture for Aspergillus and a positive galactomannan, we would diagnose this as a probable invasive pulmonary aspergillosis. But having said that, if there is a positive beta-D-glucan and a negative galactomannan, this could still be probable invasive fungal infection, which would or would not be invasive pulmonary aspergillosis, or it could be an invasive pulmonary aspergillosis with a false negative galactomannan assay. But in either of these situations, since we are dealing with a probable invasive pulmonary aspergillosis situation, we can initiate therapy with a voriconazole with or without an echinocandin. Now, in case cultures and serum galactomannan and serum beta-glucan are negative, then we have to consider invasive procedures. Then we have to go on definitely to our biopsy. And then let's see what the biopsy showed. So I'm not asking anybody to read the biopsies. We are all not pathologists over here, but this is a very, very characteristic histopathology. You can see fungus over there. You can see the branched septated fungal hyphae, which definitely suggests Aspergillus. But what I would also like to draw your attention to is this small blood vessel over here. You can see there is a thrombus. The vessel is totally occluded. There is a thrombus and there is a plethora of inflammatory cells lying within the lumen of this thrombus. So this is what we will term as an angio-invasive pulmonary aspergillosis. So depending upon this degree of invasion, so the infections or the aspergillus infections can be divided into two groups. There is hypha in the tissue and there is no hypha in the tissue. So if you see the far right of the aspect of the picture, you can see that the chronic forms of pulmonary aspergillosis, including an aspergilloma, usually will not have any angioinvasion, and the hyphae will be limited to the preformed cavity. The pre-existing structural lung disease, minor immunological defects, and in this kind of patients, it takes about months or years for this to develop. But now coming to diseases where you see hyphae in the tissue, which could be invasive pulmonary aspergillosis with angioinvasion, mixed with histological picture, without angioinvasion, and then other forms of invasive chronic pulmonary aspergillosis. These are usually seen in prolonged and profound neutropenic patients, or patients who have severe immunocompromised state, such as patients with long-term corticosteroid therapy, AIDS or HIV patients, non-neutropenic hematocell stem cell transplant patient, hematopoietic stem cell transplant patient, or in patients with graft versus host disease. This usually takes about weeks to months to develop, or in profound neutropenia, it can appear very rapidly. So here, what we are dealing with is a case which is non-neutropenic, but has severe immunosuppression comorbidities. On the TBLB, we see that it is invasive pulmonary aspergillosis with angioinvasion. So the question here is this a proven invasive aspergillosis now? Or is it a probable invasive aspergillosis still? Or are we just dealing with a possible invasive aspergillosis? Or would you like to call it something else? So that's the poll question. And while the audience is taking the poll, I'd like to get some comments from Yuvarajan over here.
Yes, actually I already explained that this is actually clear cut. Okay, you took a biopsy and you just confirm there is a tissue invasion is there. You have shown the vessel that is occluded. Everything is very classical. So what more than you need? So I think it's proven invasive aspergillosis. Yeah, because among all the tests, biopsy is one of the specific tests. You did that and you got the result. So that's it. There's no question in that diagnosis. Yeah,
absolutely. I think this was the clearest question, the simplest question of them all. Because we have all the we have all the mix that is required to answer that question. We have an appropriate host factor. We have the clinical picture of the disease. We have microbiological evidence of aspergillus, and also we have a histopathological evidence of demonstrating an angioinvasive aspergillosis over here. So Vipul, are the poll answers in?
Yeah. So sir, as Dr. Yuvarajan again said, 75% of them, yes, have said proven invasive aspergillosis as in their choice, and 20% are still in doubt, and they are saying probable invasive aspergillosis. So majority of them have takes.
A little doubt always is good for taking the discussion further. So
you really have to paranoid always.
So let me clarify all these doubts. So this is the diagnostic criteria. This is an article that I borrowed from the European Respiratory Journal as an overview and the review article, which was published for guidelines published for invasive pulmonary aspergillosis. So there are three categories that we need to see. There are three basic points. There is a proven invasive pulmonary aspergillosis, there is a probable pulmonary aspergillosis, and there is a possible pulmonary aspergillosis. So what you need to diagnose as a proven IPA is a histopathological or cytopathological examination of the lung tissue showing hyphae, or needle aspiration or biopsy specimen with evidence of associated tissue damage, or a positive culture result of aspergillus from a sample obtained by sterile procedure from the lung, and a clinically or radiologically abnormal site consistent with infection. So our case satisfies all of these parameters. So it is definitely a proven invasive pulmonary aspergillosis. Now let's look at what is probable. So for probable, you need to understand what the host factors are. And if you see the table on to the left, this is the host factor. Prolonged neutropenia, that is less than 500 cells per cubic millimeter for more than 10 days. Transplantation, where market highest risk is with lung transplantation and hematopoietic stem cell transplantation. prolonged, that is more than 3 weeks of high-dose corticosteroid therapy, hematological malignancies, the highest risk with being with leukemias, chemotherapy, advanced AIDS, and chronic granular matter diseases. So if you have these host factors with a mycological evidence, that is positive aspergillus microscopy or culture from sputum or bowel, or a positive antigen assay, and a clinical criteria consistent with that infection, you would diagnose that as a probable IPA, as we saw in our diagnostic algorithm. But if it is only a host factor from the table and a clinical criteria in the absence of microbiological or pathological evidence, then you call it as a possible infection. And very interestingly, a cartoon has been put forth over here, which clearly shows how the spectrum changes from invasive pulmonary aspergillosis to subacute infection to chronic infection and to ABPA or severe asthma with fungal sensitization as the immune function of the patient changes. Once we are dealing with immune dysfunction, and as the degree of that immune suppression increases, the chances of an invasive infection increase. Whereas on the flip side, when your immune system starts to become normal and then goes into a hyperdrive with immune hyperreactivity, you can see you deal more with immunological phenomena seen in ABPA and seen in severe asthma with fungal sensitization. So with that, I'd like to go on to the next question, that what would be the best choice of antifungals from here? So we all know that whenever we are dealing with fungal infections, there are three mainstays of treatment that we have. We have azole antifungals, we have polyenes, and we have echinocandins. So I've purposely put that Venn sort of a diagram over here, because do we want to use only an amphotericin B? Do we want to use only voriconazole? Do we want to upfront start with anidulafungin over here? Or do you want to go with a combination therapy of amphotericin B and voriconazole? Just a twist in this question over here. So while the audience goes for a poll, let me bring in Dr. Rajalakshmi over here and ask her what her initial plan of therapy would be for this patient.
So as discussed in my slides, the drug of choice for invasive aspergillosis is voriconazole. So other options are there, and we can select those in certain conditions, but the drug of choice is VORI. And at this point, when you start ORI for this patient, I would clarify with Dr. Jindal about whether this patient is on tacrolimus and any other drugs, because I'm worried about the drug interaction. The patient should not go in for either a toxicity, and because this can happen, but much more worrisome would be a low level of TAC or any other immunosuppression resulting in rejection. So, but I'm bothered about toxicity also. So I will be very careful with monitoring both VORI and TAC levels if I'm starting on VORI. And VORI is the drug of choice. When do you use amphotericin is the question. Next question. So ampho is used when ORI fails. We can use a combination. And as the echinocandins are used as a salvage therapy in case where you cannot use amphotericin or voriconazole due to toxicity. You can add and Caspo or microfungin to VORI regime, ampho regime, or you can use it as a standalone therapy, but that choice is the last one. The option would be VORI followed by liposomal ampho or combination, and then comes salvage therapy, that is ECMO.
So before I move on to that, so let me ask Vipul, do we have the poll answers over here?
Yeah, so I think this time they have heard Dr. Rajalakshmi ma'am, and majority of them have said around 63% as in their choice for voriconazole, followed by 25% as in the combination of ampho and VORI, and minuscule around 12% only for amphotericin B. But none of them have their takers for this, echinocandins or anidulafungin as in the echinocandin.
Excellent. I think that is a very good mix, very good distribution of the answers which have been given. What we did for this case, I'll just reveal after I go through this review slide over here. So this is the protocol that has been given by IDSA, that the primary therapy is to start with voriconazole. And I think Dr. Rajalakshmi has already discussed the doses also over here. We start with 6 milligrams per kg body weight on day 1 loading dose, followed by 4 milligrams per kg body weight up to a week, and then switch over to oral, which is 200 milligrams twice a day. Now, good point over here is, since this is a post-transplant patient, you have to also monitor and also think about maintaining the graft function here. So voriconazole has a very strong interaction with tacrolimus, and it increases the drug level of tacrolimus. The trough levels of tacrolimus go high. So what we need to do is we need to keep testing for tacrolimus maybe every alternate day to start with, to make sure what dose adjustment we need to do so as to maintain the trough level between 8 to 10 nanograms per deciliter. That is the target range that we want to maintain. We don't want it to go very high, because then it will start giving you toxicities from the renal point of view. And very common with the sudden increases in tacrolimus doses is CNS toxicity. The patients will start having encephalopathy-like features, which become a nightmare for these patients and for the medical teams to handle. Secondly, the alternative therapies are liposomal amphotericin B lipid complex, caspofungin, micafungin, posaconazole, or itraconazole coming down into the mix subsequently. So what we actually did for this patient was use a combination therapy. Because if you remember, we are not just dealing with an invasive pulmonary aspergillosis over here, but we also had tracheobronchial accumulation. We also had debris which was there near the anastomosis. And anastomosis is a very important site post-lung transplant that you have to keep debris-free, that you have to keep infection-free, because it's one of the weakest site from the entire system at that point of time, and very amenable that severe infection at that site can lead to dehiscence, can lead to rupture, can lead to pneumothorax formations. So what we did was we started the patient on nebulized liposomal amphotericin B. We started with 50 milligrams dose per day divided in 2 times. And then after a week, we switched to 25 milligrams dose divided in 2 doses per day. And side-by-side voriconazole IV therapy was started, which was tapered off over a week to oral therapy. And the patient did phenomenally well with the medications given. But the case did not stop over here. A few weeks down the line, the patient revisited us. So as you can guess from the question that I put to the poll, it was definitely an extrapulmonary spread of the aspergillus here. So the question now is, what is the most common site? Is it bone? Is it brain? Is it the sinuses? Or is it the lymph nodes? So Dr. Yuvraj, you want to pitch in there?
Yeah. Basically, see, when the patient with invasive pulmonary aspergillosis is there, we want to differentiate whether it is localized in the lung or it is there simultaneously extrapulmonary site also. In that case, in case of disseminated form, you may get a simultaneous sinusitis along with the invasive pulmonary aspergillosis. This is true with even with other invasive fungal infections also, like for example mucormycosis. Maybe it may present early with a nasal paranasal sinus. You may miss that, and you may diagnose in the invasive one in the lungs. Here, there is very specific. In your case, it is very specific that it is there only in the lungs and also the form of tracheal bronchitis. So I think brain is one other thing. Brain and this thing we have to just rule out. Yeah, because brain, I feel.
Excellent. So Vipul, do we have the results?
We'll just have to wait a few more seconds for this, sir. We'll get it shortly. Submitting.
Actually, Dr. Rajalakshmi has already given out the answer during her slides. She presented, very well in a tabulated manner that what are the common sites of presentations for extrapulmonary spread for invasive pulmonary aspergillosis, and where definitely the CNS spread or the brain spread tops the chart. So let's see how many of the people actually paid attention.
We just received responses, and majority of them, around 56% of them, have said brain as in the most common site for extrapulmonary spread, followed by 45% of them have said that paranasal sinus is the common site.
So I think people are thinking also about zygomycetes. They are thinking about mucor over here along with pulmonary aspergillosis. So let's see what happened to this case. So 3 weeks later, she presented with left side weakness and a headache. The CT showed extensive edema in the right cerebral hemisphere surrounding a mass-like lesion. An MRI was also done, which reported a large lesion in the right basal ganglia extending into frontal lobe, suspicious of a fungal abscess. But this is a post-transplant patient. Everything has to be documented. Everything has to be diagnosed preferably with tissue diagnosis. So we did a brain biopsy for this patient, and it turned out to be a chronic abscess with fragments of fungal hyphae showing aspergillus. This patient was now treated with a combination of IV voriconazole and anidulafungin for 2 weeks, and then put on voriconazole therapy further. The voriconazole therapy for this patient was continued for almost about 10 months, and her weakness and headache improved, and the symptoms actually dissipated quite well. So when we talk about extrapulmonary spread in invasive aspergillosis, there are two very important studies which are there. One looks at this spread in AIDS patient, and the other one looks at this spread extrapulmonary spread in transplant patient. And you can see as from the highlighted boxes that most of them show that brain is the most common site for invasive pulmonary aspergillosis spread or invasive aspergillosis spread. The other sites can be liver, it can be lymph node, it can even be bone, where osteomyelitis has also been reported. So with that, I'll come to the conclusion of my case, the end of my case, and just spend maybe 4 or 5 slides to review fungal infections in post-lung transplant cases. So the most common pathogens over here, which are different fungi which are involved after lung transplantation, are aspergillus, most in 44% of the cases, candida in about 23% of the cases, where aspergillus fumigatus is the most common species and candida albicans is the most common species. And then less often we see pseudosporum, mucor or rhizopus, cryptococcus. Endemic mycoses, including histoplasma, coccidioidosis, blastomycosis, very rare as it is in our country, but this also constitute 1% of the post-lung transplant fungal infections worldwide. And now pneumocystis jirovecii, PCP pneumonia, which was a very common occurrence post-lung transplant, in view of the cotrimoxazole prophylaxis, which has become a standard in lung transplant care protocol across the world, the numbers have fallen down from a whooping 63% to 15% in the presence of in the absence of prophylaxis. What are the risk factors? So we saw a significant number of risk factors which were laid out for invasive pulmonary aspergillosis infections. But what are the general risk factors for getting fungal infections post-lung transplant? The most important thing is the lung itself. There is a constant exposure of the transplant lung to the external environment. Plus, post-transplant, there is impaired ciliary function, there is a blunted cough reflex, and denervation injury in the newly transplanted lung, which lead to accumulation and colonization of more fungal spores here. Airway ischemia due to an anastomotic ischemic time, especially in the older patients. Patients who develop CMV disease, these are again more at risk for developing concomitant or post-CMV sequelae with fungal infections. Single lung transplant recipients, wherein endemic fungus from the native lung can infect the transplanted graft. Pre-transplant colonization in the lung or paranasal sinuses. A lot of the times paranasal sinuses are mixed. These infections are missed in these patients, and it presents as a fungal pneumonia post-transplant, especially in cases of cystic fibrosis and bronchiectasis. Patients who have bronchial stents for airway complications, and finally over-immunizations leading to neutropenia, hypogammaglobulinemia, and T-cell depletion. Very, very important. And the most important, and this is one of the very critical things that we have seen in many and many patients, is exposure to farming or construction dusts. So post-transplant patients, this is a strict instruction to them, and this is a strict counseling given to them that they cannot be located in these kind of locations. So what is the clinical spectrum of fungal infections post-lung transplant? We have 4 types of infections, starting with an anastomotic infection, which is seen early post-transplant period, and between 4.9 to 25% of the cases, presents with spirometry changes, noisy breathing, increased and tough secretions, and mainly because of candida and aspergillus, but rarely mucor has also been reported here. You can have pneumonias, as we saw in our case. Here, BAL, TBLB is definitely required to diagnose it when the clinical setting of nodules or consolidations is seen on the CT. Aspergillus here is the most common infection. You can have mediastinus, stenitis, or pleural infection, and Dr. Yuvarajan is going to bring up a very nice case with extra pulmonary involvement as well. So mediastinitis is usually seen with candida, whereas pleural infections are usually seen with aspergillus, and then there could be a disseminated infection, as we saw in our case. And as you've seen, that voriconazole, when we are talking about aspergillus, remains the mainstay of therapy. Now, coming to antifungal prophylaxis post-transplant, this is usually continued either up to 3 months or up to 1 year, depending upon the protocol, depending upon the endemic fungal infections in the local areas where the lung transplant program is situated. And it can be done in two manners. One is called as a preemptive treatment. That means you don't start with an upfront antiprophylaxis. You wait for up to 3 months and you see if the patient develops an Aspergillus infection during these 3 months. You put them on therapy. And then the other thing is immediately in the post-operative period, you start them on voriconazole prophylaxis. So both, there is no consensus. There's no clear guidelines as to which method trumps the other. So either of the methods can be used. And why is it important? You can see very clearly from these outlines that patients who do develop Aspergillus infections do much worse as compared to those who do not develop any Aspergillus infection. And even in the Aspergillus, patients who develop an invasive infection have a much higher mortality and a much lower survival as compared to patients who do not, who develop a non-invasive Aspergillus infection. So infection is not just bad enough, but an invasive infection is an even worse condition. So what were the learning points? And this is my last slide now. Post-lung transplant fungal infections contribute significantly to the morbidity and mortality. Controversy remains regarding the optimal drug and duration of prophylaxis. Common methods to avoid exposure, such as masks, are encouraged. It may manifest as invasive anastomosis, lung parenchyma, pleural or mediastinal space, or disseminated infections. Galactomannan and beta-D-glucan can be used as biomarkers, and voriconazole is the mainstay of therapy, with amphotericin B and echinocandins offering good alternates. With that, I thank you all for this patient listening, and I thank Dr. Yuvarajan, Dr. Rajalakshmi for pitching in beautifully and taking the discussion forward. And then obviously I have to, I can't go away without thanking Abbott for creating the stage and creating the event, making it possible. Thank you all. Over to you, Dr. Rajalakshmi.
So there were several learning points which we discussed in each step. One was clinical diagnosis, second was radiology, third was diagnostics and treatment as well. So in each step, we had actually it was a much more like a revision. So we could reiterate what has to be done practically, what we learn in theory. It is such a beautiful case. And more importantly, the thing is the host. Host is a very, very, very important factor for Aspergillus. As you can see, post-transplant is an ideal setting for aspergillosis, especially it can setting early. It will not set early on if the patient is on prophylaxis, as in this case, and it presents as a late infection after 1 year or so. So that's a most important learning point. You have to keep thinking all these possibilities whenever the patient is off the prophylaxis for aspergillosis or CMV, for that matter, any other infection. A wonderful case, Dr. Jinder. Thanks for sharing that. And I now invite Professor Yuvarajan for his case. Again, it is a case of aspergillosis, but in a different presentation, a rare presentation. Please take the stage, sir.
Yeah. So can you see my slides?
Yes.
Is it okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. First of all, thanks Abbott for organizing this wonderful webinar on this evening, and thank you, Dr. Rajalakshmi and Dr. Appar Jinder, for coming over here, and we are discussing about invasive aspergillosis, one of the most challenging thing sometimes in ICU. So without wasting much of time, I'm just directly going to my case. So this is a 41-year-old male who's a chronic alcoholic, came to our casualty with complaints of epigastric pain for the past 5 days. He is not a known case of hypertension diabetes or asthma or any history of tuberculosis, past history of tuberculosis. So as he presented with acute abdomen, initially he was admitted under a surgical unit and evaluated for acute abdomen. So at the time they asked for a bedside ultrasound abdomen. So they found that everything is okay except for the pancreas, which showed mild echogenic pancreas with thin rim of peripancreatic fluid around it. This was the initial laboratory data from the patients. Till this time, the patient was under surgical unit. So his hemoglobin is around 15.7 grams per DL. There is a leukocytosis there with neutrophil predominance. And amylase lipase is almost normal, and urea creatinine is almost normal. Everything is okay, and they have done serology also. It is normal. So this was the chest X-ray at the time of presentation. So you could see that chest X-ray shows almost like there is a non-visualization of left hemidiaphragm along with the obliteration of left costophrenic and cardiophrenic angle, and there is heterogeneous opacity in the left mid and lower zone, which is not saluting with the left heart border. And the data ECG showed only sinus tachycardia. And since the patient presents epigastric pain and is an alcoholic and old age, we need to rule out any acute coronary syndrome. So cardiac enzymes also was sent, so which was it was negative. So with that X-ray, they took a pulmonology opinion on the next day of admission, thinking that the patient had a acute abdomen. So they worked out further, and then they took our opinion the next day. The patient also gave history of left-sided chest pain. So when we probed the history to the patient, he told that it is not only epigastric pain. So he also told to our residents that the patient is having a left-sided chest pain, which is typically like a pleuritic type of pain, which is increased on deep inspiration for the past 5 days. And he also complained of a dry cough. It's a non-productive cough, and dyspnea, which is there, which is progressive for the past 2 days. So on examination from our side, the patient is conscious, alert, but tachypneic, using axillary muscles of respiration with a pulse rate around 112 beats per minute with a BP of around 130 by 90. It's not 136, it's 130 by 90. And respirated around 38 breaths per minute with SpO2 of 94% at room air. On palpation, he just complained of intercostal tenderness that's mainly over the left infraaxillary area. And there is a reduced vesicular blood sounds mainly in the left side infraaxillary and mammary area. Since the patient is tachypneic using axillary muscles of respiration, patient was transferred to our RICU for further evaluation and treatment. So then the patient was tachypneic using axillary muscle of respiration to avoid respiratory failure and to support the tiring muscles. Non-invasive ventilation was given for the patient. In the meantime, so we did a repeat X-ray for the same patient. You could see the finding in the repeat X-ray. You could see the worsening of the condition within a matter of 72 hours. So with this history of presentation as an acute abdomen with epigastric pain with a pleuritic chest pain on the left side in a chronic alcoholic with no other positive history, what is your most probable diagnosis? So shall we start the polling? So is it a pancreatitis with pancreatic effusion? Is it a pleural effusion due to esophageal tear? Is it a paramnetic effusion, or is it a TB effusion in a chronic alcoholic? So can we start a poll? What is others' opinion? What is Madam's opinion on this?
Okay.
Dr. Rajalakshmi, Madam?
Yeah. All these are possible. I didn't recall the amylase lipase levels. Can you please?
Everything is normal. It is just in amylase is around 30. Lipase is around some 35, 36. That's it.
And it is an acute presentation over last
Yes, it is
days.
an acute presentation. Yeah.
So if this being an acute presentation is an alcoholic with, it could very well be an esophageal tear with pleural effusion possible because it's an acute presentation. Second is a pneumonic effusion because it's most likely what we see is a left-sided effusion. And third possibility is always a TB effusion. But it won't usually present with abdominal pain unless there is a pericardial effusion also. A pericardial effusion can be associated with this, and this can present in many of the ways like chest pain, upper abdominal pain, which can occur in TB. It can occur in esophageal tear. It can occur in any associated parapneumonic effusion of pericarditis. It could be viral, it could be bacterial, it could be TB. Pancreatitis, probably just likely after hearing the amylase lipase level, probably less likely. But other things are all possible.
Yeah. Can we have the poll results?
Yeah, so we received the poll responses, sir. The audience, I think it is, they have shared and they do not want to dissatisfy any option. So they have given the fragmented response over here. 30% as
Okay.
in for the pancreatitis with pancreatic effusion, 30% for parapneumonic effusion, 30% for TB effusion in a chronic alcoholic, and a very minute fragmented response to pleural effusion due to viscofragility.
Yeah.
So,
See, actually, as we were discussing that all these possibilities are can be an option when we think this acute presentation in a chronic alcoholic. So one thing is that it's very sure that amylase lipase is near normal, and there will be in case of basal pneumonia, even this pancreatic pancreatitis like feature like thin fluid around the pancreas is very common. It is not so. The pancreatitis with pancreatic effusion, even that situation also. In case of acute pancreatitis, you will have a mild to moderate effusion, not like this a massive effusion that puttu in the left side unilateral. So that's somewhat that's a massive effusion pancreatitis is not very common. Moreover, amylase lipase is also within normal. It's totally unusual. And the second possibility, pleural effusion difficulty here, of course, definitely. This should be considered as one of the DD because the patient present on the left side of the effusion is progressively increasing. And in this situation of esophageal tear, usually the patient gives history of binge alcohol intake. At the same time, the profuse nausea, vomiting, other immune this thing will be there. So here it is not that, but still it has to be considered. And the third option is the paramnemic effusion. Of course, definitely it has to be considered because chronic alcoholic and there is in the initial X-ray there was a consolidation in the left mid and lower zone. There is a minimal effusion was there. Within 3 days it has progressed, and this can be considered. And one more finding in the examination, like the patient also had an intercostal tenderness, which may not be there in other situations. Like unless the patient is having a complicated paramnemic effusion or empyema, you will have a local tenderness. You will have the thing. So that is there. In TB effusion also, unless the patient is having empyema, in simple TB effusion, you don't have a local tenderness and all. So it's very rare. They have the patient with the present pain. At the same time, a TB effusion won't evolve so rapidly like this. It's have a slow process like that. It has an indolent course, except for in young individuals, it may have some different presentation. This patient is a chronic alcoholic. This much of rapid evolution may not be there. So options are here B and C. We have to rule out these two. Okay, then what we did is that we did a bedside USG thorax, and it showed a gross collection in the left pleural space with the multiple internal echoes was there, which was suggestive of empyema. At that time, we did a diagnostic tapping, which was a frank pus that was aspirated. At the same time, since the patient was moribund, in respiratory failure, having almost near massive left-sided collection, so ICD was inserted and around 1,500 ml of frank pus was drained. And the same pus was sent to all our necessary microbiology analysis like gram stain, culture, AFB, and fungal smear also. So post ICD insertion, the patient's tachypnea got settled down. And at the same time, we want to know what is the exact reason for that. So we plan for CD thorax once the patient settled. But the patient was, having respiratory failure. He can't be shifted to CT. He can't hold the breath. So we just postponed that. So with the working diagnosis of left empyema with sepsis and impending ARDS, the patient was started on broad spectrum antibiotics, clindamycin in addition to the piperacillin tazobactam, and the patient was continued with the non-invasive ventilation support. So these were the reports like we got after this pulse culture and all. Gram stain, there was no evidence of bacteria in that, and culture, there is no pyogenic culture, there is no growth. AFB, it is smear negative for AFB, and fungal smear we asked. Initially they told that it was negative, but we were suspecting that no organism was there, and the patient was worsening. So when we recalled the microbiology, they told that it was showing a few septate branching fungal elements was seen in the smear, and CBNet was also done, which was not detected at the time. And sputum examination, we did gram stain culture, which was showing only common salts, and fungal smear showed the similar finding, like few septate branching fungal elements were seen. And in sputum culture, sputum fungal culture was negative, and other cultures also was unyielding. And sputum CBNet was sent, which was once again negative for MTB. Okay. this was one of the poll question. Which are the following shows of false positive result with beta 1,3 glucan assay? You know that this is one of the biomarkers we can do for this immunoaspergillosis. It was extensively discussed by the last two speakers. Those false positive result with beta 1,3 glucan. Is it a PCP? Is it a Candida? Or it is Pseudomonas aeruginosa? Or it is all the above? So we can start the poll. And before going to that, I want Dr. Apar Jindal's opinion on this. Even though we are not commonly doing this beta 1,3 glucan, so just have an academic touch in it. So what is your opinion, Dr. Apar?
See,
regarding the usage of beta 1,3 glucan, we know that is there in all the fungal cell wall.
Yeah, so the very important point that you've already put out and what needs to be understood that this is a normal component of fungal cell wall. So wherever you have fungus, you can always see a beta D glucan. So definitely PCP will show it, Candida will show it. Beta D glucan assay is very commonly associated with the diagnosis of Candida, diagnosis of Aspergillus. So when you're looking at PCP, definitely you can see over here. So one more point that I'd like to make over here is not just the presence of other organisms, the presence of certain foods, and Dr. Rajalakshmi can correct me and add on to that further. Presence of certain food, presence of other drugs. When we're talking about galactomannan, very important, we have to remember the treatment with beta-lactam antibiotics, especially things like piperacillin, tazobactam combinations. So there are many variables which can affect the positivity of these tests, positivity or negativity of these tests. Ma'am, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So PCP and Candida can cause a beta D glucan rise, and it's not considered a false positive. Probably we don't know. So, but Candida, in Candida, the titer that we usually see in beta D glucan values are above 400. The cutoff is 80. Cutoff of this value is 80, but we've seen very high levels in Candida in also PCP. And other bacteria can also cause this false positive result. This can be like Streptococcus, but I'm not sure about Pseudomonas. I'm not very sure. Probably you can add.
What was the poll opinion from other audience?
Dr. Yuvarajan, audience have shared their responses between Candida and PCP. So 45% between the Candida and 45% for PCP, and very minuscule for all of the above. But none of them have tests for the Pseudomonas.
See, basically, why I just purposefully put this question just for the interest of postgraduates and other those who want to have some academic touch in it. So even though that was discussed that beta 1,3 glucan that we are not commonly using when compared to galactomannan, because galactomannan is superior in case of BAL. Beta 1,3 glucan is usually done in serum. So as we have discussed that it is one of the commonest component in the fungal cell wall, and most of the fungus will show a positive beta 1,3 glucan. And one point I want to add here is that there is a lot of reports that the presence of Pseudomonas aeruginosa also, even that also, their cell wall also have this beta 1,3 glucan. In the setting of mixed infections, particularly in the patients with sepsis, along with invasive aspergillosis. So sometimes the Pseudomonas aeruginosa also will have a false positive result. That is the point I want to stress here. And one more point with the beta 1,3 glucan assay I want to stress here is that if you are in a situation that you are dealing with invasive fungal infections, but you are not very sure that whether it is Aspergillus or in mucor, because sometimes for microbiologists it is very difficult before a culture, because we have to wait for the culture for some days. In microscopy, sometimes there is a difficulty when you centrifuge the sample, when the hypha is there. The Aspergillus hypha is very thin, whereas a mucor hypha is very broad. It's a ribbon-based hypha is there. Sometimes what happens is the hypha of a mucor is somewhat fragile. Okay, when you centrifuge it, what will happen for this in the KOH mode or some other mode you do it? This is the information I got from microbiology that it folds on itself sometimes. Since it folds on itself, normally mucor will give a acute angle branching. Right angle branching. That is 90-degree branching will be there. It is a broad aseptate hyphae, and it is a ribbon-based hyphae. It will be there. And sometimes when you centrifuge it, what will happen? This hyphae will fold on itself, and it resembles like Aspergillus in some situation. In that situation, without waiting for culture report, if you send this beta-1,3 glycan can never be positive in a patient with a mucus. That's the one point that I want to stress among this invasive, among the markers that what we do for invasive fungal infections. So going on to our case that, we got all the, this positive sign in fungal smear and all. What we did is that we did a bronchoscopy to confirm that the presence of invasive pulmonary aspergillosis. So bedside bronchoscopy was performed. Actually, this patient was very tachypneic. I think I've just told that the patient was with NIV. So what we did is that we did a bronchoscopy under specialized mask. Okay, so with NIV support, we did a bronchoscopy, and then bronchoscopy, which showed a brownish mucopurine secretions that was there in all the segmental bronchus, and the mucosa was totally unhealthy. At the same time, we just planned for a transbronchial lung biopsy, but we could not, because we don't know whether what will happen to culture, because we got in sputum also aseptic type A, in pleural fluid also aseptic type A. At the point was rightly told by Dr. Appar that pleural space should be sterile for this fungus. So the presence of the fungus in the pleural space is almost confirmatory that this is definitely not a colonizer. It's definitely a pathogenic organism. That's the one point is there. But still we just tried, but the patient could not tolerate the procedure even for bronchoscopy and ball. So we have to abandon the procedure. We took sufficient ball, and then the bronchial lavage was sent for fungal smear and culture, which also yielded the growth of Aspergillus species after three days. And we also sent this galactomannan assay in the ball, which showed almost like 1.32. The cutoff is only 0.5. The 0.5 can pick most of the patients of invasive pulmonary aspergillosis. Here it is around around 1.32, which is significantly elevated in this patient. So this was the picture we got from the microbiologist. That initially I told one story. Now that microbiologist initially told that no fungal hyphae was there. As you can see in the first image, you can see hardly one or two branched hyphae are there. So by overlooking, they are telling that they told that no fungal elements are there in the KOH pond. Later, then we stressed the point that the patient not responding, just kindly see. So then they told that definitely there is some fungus is there, and this was the picture. So now the question for you is, which of the following invasive fungal infection is not considered as a differential diagnosis based on this microscopic picture? So can we start the poll? And before the poll end, I just want to ask Dr. Rajalakshmi Madam. This type of picture is there in the microscopy. What do you think, as a before the culture comes? What do you think, like the common fungus can cause this type of picture? And the one option here doesn't give a picture like this. What is that, ma'am? Yes.
Which doesn't such a picture. Okay.
Yeah. See, yes, madam.
See, these I can't see it clearly, but I can see it's all thin, not broad, and it's all acutely branching. As you said, this is a smear, and in histopathology it can be crushed, and all the morphology can be lost.
Yes.
So it is less likely zygomyces, that I can say. And I can't see the fusarium. Fusarium usually is all sickle-shaped, the cells, but I can't see it clearly. And it can be invasive aspergillus, obviously. Yeah.
So what about the audience response on this?
We are just receiving the answers within the span of few seconds.
Yeah.
Just have to wait for a few more seconds and just get the audience response. I
just wanted to tell Dr. Yuvraj that we had a case of refugee cause in Klebsiella, but Pseudomonas can also happen. We had Streptococcus and Klebsiella, but I think that Pseudomonas can also.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, we just received the audience response for this. So, majority of them, 60% of them are saying pulmonary zygomycosis as in their choice, followed by the fragmented response between the invasive aspergillosis, that is the 20%, and pseudoscoriosis as in for the another 20%. But none of them have said for the invasive fusariosis as in their choice. So majority of them have gone for pulmonary zygomycosis.
Okay, already I just described the microscopy of all the different invasive fungal infections what we see in day-to-day practice. The two common invasive fungal infections what we see in our ICU is the invasive aspergillosis and invasive mucormycosis. Okay, the differentiation is very simple. The Aspergillus hypha, if you see here in this in this slide, you can see that in the microscopy, it is long, slender, thin, and the branching is so acute. So it could be acute, branched, thin, slender hyphae, and septated. So diagnosis is very simple. It is invasive aspergillosis. But one thing you need to consider is that there are other fungus, other invasive fungus that can give a similar picture like this. That is a pseudosporiosis. This is the second most common fungus other than aspergillus because aspergillus is very is ubiquitous in our environment. Okay, so second most common fungus which is very, very common in the environment. So that is pseudosporiosis, that is Pseudoalergia boydii. You should tell that. So that also gives acute angle branching. The same similar slender hyphae will be there. And same thing as Madam told, fusariosis, like there is slight, a morphological appearance like sickle cell appearance will be there. Even that also is a acute angle branching, which is one of the close DD for invasive aspergillosis. Here, the option which is should not be considered is that zygomycosis, that is a mucor. Mucor is actually a short, stout, and broad hyphae. It's actually a tape-like. It's a ribbon-shaped hyphae. It is aseptate. It is aseptate, and that branching is almost like right angles, almost 90 degree, like like a T shape. A short segment will be there. So with that, you can easily identify zygomycosis. Okay, with all the features like even though clinical feature is atypical, so we got a confirmation that culture, the pleural fluid culture, which is a sterile area for this fungus, actually, if it is positive, definitely we should consider as a pathogenic. And Ball also showed the growth of aspergillus along with the elevated ball galactomannan. So the diagnosis confirmed as was confirmed as invasive pleuropulmonary aspergillosis, which is one of the rare presentation, along with the ARDS. So this was already discussed by the previous speakers. I'm just skipping this slide. So what we did for this patient is that as we confirm the diagnosis, as we already discussed, that the drug of choice for any invasive pulmonary aspergillosis is that voriconazole. We started this patient on voriconazole as with a conventional dose, 6 mg per kg on day 1, twice daily, followed by 4 mg per kg on subsequent days with other supportive measures. Because as the patient is in respiratory failure, we have to deal with that also along with the management of invasive fungal infections. And the patient was not showing any clinical response, and there is a rapid worsening with hypoxemia was there for this patient. So we want to rule out any, secondary bacterial infection or coexistent bacterial infections are there. So initially only we sent this blood culture, urine culture, and everything. So there is no growth was there in the blood culture and urine culture. So we want to know exactly why he just developed this such a moribund illness, like with extensive disease with like pleuropulmonary involvement. So we did a complete profile of immunoglobulin profile for this patient. So that was also normal. And at the same time, since the patient was worsening, we want to rule out secondary bacterial infection. So initially also we did a procalcitonin, and after 3 days also we did. It was almost within normal limits. So you could see initially it was only left side presentation. After I'll show that, I'll show the X-ray after intercostal drainage. This was the X-ray after intercostal drainage. You could see the right side, not much of infiltrate except for the right upper zone, mid zone. And you could see right, left mid zone, lower zone, there is heterogeneous opacity along with the effusion with ICD in situ was there. But within 72 hours, so you could see this was the X-ray. It was almost ulta. Like you could see there is a left side, there's a consolidation is there, but in the right side you could see almost like near whiteout lung, almost like hardly you could see any parenchymal features are there. Right side is almost whiteout lung, and the patient was very tachypneic and clinically worsened very badly. So as there was a clinical worsening even after starting voriconazole after 4 days, and there is a new progressive infiltration on the right lung. So what we have a doubt that whether voriconazole is really working for this patient or not. So we ask for microbiologists like whether we can do a testing, we can do a sensitivity, we can do a culture sensitivity for this fungus, Aspergillus species fungus, what you isolated. Then microbiologist answered that the doing a culture sensitivity for the filamentous fungus, particularly for Aspergillus and other mucor, is a big job. And I don't think in India except for the research purpose. They are not doing culture sensitivity of filamentous fungus. And our microbiologist told that even the doing culture sensitivity for this group of filamentous fungus is not validated till now. So the only fungus for which the culture sensitivity is done commonly is Candida, which is validated by the Indian Microbial Association and other associations. Whereas this filamentous fungus doing culture sensitivity is not validated till now, and it is being done for only for research purpose. As we have a doubt that we have ruled out bacterial infection also, as we have a doubt that whether the patient is having some triazole resistant strain of species of Aspergillus. So we thought that we can add this amphotericin B also, because if we have to save the patient, we added liposomal amphotericin B. 4 mg per kg was added along with voriconazole. So once again, even though we have a proculture negative, already we put the patient on antibiotic. So we changed that when we escalated to injection imipenem and injection clindamycin. So patient was and their attendance were planned for elective, were explained for elective intubation, because patient was literally tachypneic. He could not lie down. He was having respirated around literally 38 to 40, even with NIV support. So we explained the attendance, but they were not willing. They were just telling that you just continue with NIV support and continue your treatment care. We give a consent for this. So we got a consent and we continued with NIV support. So after starting liposomal amphotericin B, the patient showed a partial clinical response. So we continued with this amphotericin B along with voriconazole with intermittent non-invasive ventilation. Because here the problem is that we want to do a therapeutic drug monitoring also, because we confirmed that the voriconazole is not working for this patient, whether it is because of the subtherapeutic level of voriconazole or it is because of the resistant strain what we are thinking in this patient. But for doing therapeutic drug monitoring, there are only few labs which are doing this therapeutic drug monitoring, and it takes some time also. We inquired that, they told that it takes some time. So we don't want to waste. That's why we added this liposomal amphotericin B to give a chance for the patient. And at the same time, after giving liposomal amphotericin B, the patient developed recurrent hypokalemia, which was very difficult for us. Daily, the patient was getting a potassium infusion to correct that. And once the patient got this combination of the voriconazole, liposomal amphotericin B, and within a matter of some 4 to 5 days, the patient tachypnea has settled down, and we could shift that patient at least for CT thorax to see exactly. We could find some evidence in CT. So this was the CT picture, that we did after this combination therapy. You could see there is a left-sided collection. This is the residual pneumo pocket. And at the same time, here you could see the ground glassing along with the septal thickening. So this is the phase that here also you can see in one cut, you could see in the lower cut, you can see the patchy consolidation along with nodular opacity. And here the residual pneumo pocket with collection, located collection. And this could be a starting point of all this thing, of this pleural effusion with the parenchymal, involvement. You could see a thick walled, cavity that is there in the left lower lobe. That might have ruptured into the pleura. That might have caused this pleuroparenchymal aspergillosis. And here you can also see this crazy pavement like pattern. You could see the septal thickening along with the ground glassing. This might be because of we have not taken CT in the initial phase. So the patient partially responded to all the therapies what we have given, and this could be the reason for evolution, and there's a clearing of consolidation along with the septal thickening. So we also asked for CT-based opinion since we found out that disease is somewhat localized here, even though Yardes picture is there. So we just got an opinion, but the patient was not willing to undergo any surgery. Most of the times for invasive aspergillosis, we don't go opt for surgery because disease is most of the times is not localized. We opt surgery mainly for invasive mucormycosis, not for invasive aspergillosis. And at the same time, as I already told you that we inquired the labs for voriconazole for to do the culture sensitivity, but we could not get a proper lab except for some labs which do the test for only for research purpose. And the thing is that after some 8th or 9th day, the patient complained of blurring of vision and headache. Okay, for which we got an ophthalmologist opinion, and the ophthalmologist suggested that this blurring of vision and headache is because of voriconazole, and he told that it is because of voriconazole, and it will go off, it is only transient. But actually, like on subsequent days, after 2 to 3 days, the patient told that like, he could not see anything. He just told that it is barely visible. So he could not see any of his relatives or doctor, and he could see only a black image in front of him. So that's why what we thought that then once again we got ophthalmologist opinion. They told that you better stop since the patient having this type of, because even though it is rare, so better stop the therapy. So we have we are helpless, but we want to stop the therapy because we are somewhat having a query on the therapeutic efficacy of voriconazole in this patient. Either that may be because of subtherapeutic level of voriconazole, or it may be because of resistant fungi what we are dealing. So we thought that we have to add some other antifungals since the patient showed only partial response. So here we added a salvage therapy like injection. Caspofungin was started along with liposomal amphotericin B. So after 3 days of treatment with caspofungin along with liposomal amphotericin B, the patient continued to do very well, and he showed good clinical response. And the respiratory rate come down to literally around 20 to 26. And the patient was shifted to ward after a week after this combination. So as already we explained this, what is the role of combination therapy in invasive pulmonary aspergillosis? That even though this antifungal therapies have significant toxicities and interactions, but we do select the combination therapy in a situation where when we suspect a clinical failure of an azole or with a known azole resistance, because in European countries there are some areas. They did a surveillance. There are some areas which are known to have azole resistance. In that group of patients, we can just administer this combination therapy, and treating a species with higher resistance of resistance to triazoles. That is Aspergillus calidodustus and Aspergillus terreus. These are two species which are known to have indigenous resistance to triazoles. So in this group of patients, better to use a combination therapy for a better clinical response. You could see this is the response. This is a very good response after 4 weeks, after 3 weeks of therapy. The patient symptomatically improved with all his respiratory settled down, and it was very good with significant radiological resolution. You could see almost like you could see the right lung, left lung. You could see the residual pleural thickening, and you could see the nodular opacity along with reticular shadows in the right lung. This was the mapping of his total leukocyte count. You could see on day one, when he presented, it's roughly around 20 to 23,000. Then it has just fallen down, and after that, when we just initiated voriconazole, after initiating voriconazole, also his counts was increasing like anything. We literally got a TLC count of around 40,000. After starting liposomal amphotericin B only, it started coming down, and after starting this caspofungin, once again it come back to normal. Literally, it takes around 4 to 6 weeks for his complete clinical resolution. This was the follow-up CT thorax after discharge. So for the first follow-up, we did a CT thorax. You could see the residual cavity with there's no air fluid level, and you could see the residual some ground glassing along with attenuation. And the patient was discharged with an advice for a frequent follow-up. So the take-home message for in this clinical scenario is that atypical presentation of epigastric pain, which mimic initially as a pancreatitis, the patient landed up in surgery unit, later came to us, and then later found that the patient is having a left-sided empyema. So empyema, though rare due to fungal pathology, still it can be fungal that you should consider in all your patients. So when you do a pleural sampling, when you think that something is atypical, it's better to ask for a fungal staining and culture in pleural fluid also. And suspected to have empyema of sepsis due to mixed bacterial pathology. And finally, it came as a pleuropulmonary aspergillosis. As a diagnostic yield of sputum shows low sensitivity, always you need to do a lower respiratory tract sample by obtaining a ball. In this case, taking a ball is really literally is hypophthalmic, using all his axillary muscles. So we did a bronchoscopy with NIV support for this patient with specialized mask, which showed a positive culture. And we can add this serological markers like the serological markers and biomarkers like galactomannan. We did a ball galactomannan also, which aids in diagnosis of this patient, which is better when compared to PCR and other serum galactomannan. Voriconazole, as we discussed, this is one of the preferred drug for most of the patients as a first-line therapy, for which the patient clearly has not shown any clinical response. Hence, we thought we could try some combination therapy. So, combination therapy has shown additive and synergistic effects because different mechanism of action targeting on the fungus. So, at least we could get some response, but we should be very careful that the patient should not develop any side effects. Patient should not develop any complex drug interaction. That is very important while considering this type of clinical scenario. In our case, because of combination therapy, there is a good clinical as well as radiological resolution was seen. And invasive pulmonary aspergillosis, as we discussed, that is very common in immunocompromised host. But our patient is immunocompetent except for the history of chronic alcoholism. We could not find a specific reason of immunocompromised status for this patient. As the patient was not willing for elective intubation, per se, you know that as I have just put the diagnosis of ARDS as per the criteria of ABG, his PaO2, FaO2s are literally around less than 200. But still, even though he did not give consent for elective intubation, we recovered this patient with NIV. That's one of the challenging things because ARDS patient with NIV is still controversial. Recovering the NIV support is controversial. And we could recover this patient with NIV support and we end up successfully with our treatment protocols and ICU protocols. And that's it. All the things that we have discussed in the previous cases, the protocols and other things. So this case is totally different. Like, every moment is thrilling. Like starting from the clinical presentation, starting from the diagnosis, doing a bronchoscopy in a patient with severe hypoxemia, and starting a regular therapy for this patient, but it's not working. When you want to do additional testing, that testing is so complex that you could not find a proper laboratory to do the test. And finally, without any immunocompromised status, we got a case like this with a pulmonary with a pleural presentation. It's really, we were really happy in saving this patient of invasive pleural pulmonary aspergillosis. Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Yuvraj, for that wonderful case. Actually, we know when empyema, only the two DDs that comes to your mind is bacterial or TB.
Yeah.
Third, TB. Fourth, TB. That's it. So it's a very rare case, which I think you did your best in thinking the diagnosis. Otherwise, the patient would have gone with empiric APP, like any other.
Yes.
Any other.
Yeah.
And this patient belongs to the high-risk group that we usually tell. He has alcoholism. As you say, the alcoholism, chronic liver disease, CKD is all soft risk factor or expanded risk factor. And probably he had an aspiration or something. And that was, as you can see, Rayprom, when he took a CT, there was a cavity. And that was probably was a source. It is a very, very good case. And you did all proper measures to clinch the diagnosis. And it is also a case of learning value because you tried the salvage therapy and patient did well. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And with this, I think we had two elaborate, wonderful cases in two different setups, two different pathology. Though it involved the lung, the presentation is totally different. And we had an extensive discussion on each step of diagnosis through management. And many thanks to Dr. Jindal and Dr. Yuvarajan for that basis of learning values. I know that we have crossed our time with cross. So if there are one or two questions, we'll accept those and answer the audience questions. Otherwise, I would like to wind up this session. My sincere thanks to Abbott for arranging this wonderful session. We know that we are overloaded with COVID and many other viral diseases. And as an IT physician, we love fungus the best, followed by virus, but no more virus. So I also enjoyed the whole session. So if there are any couple of questions, we will take that. Otherwise, we will close this session.
Just a query from my side, madam. Like regarding this azole resistance, like how to confirm? Like we inquired a lot of labs. Only few labs they are doing, and they are telling that it is not validated through a culture for filamentous fungus in India.
You're right. See, what your microbiologist told is right. For filamentous fungi, we don't have sensitivity. It's done in few labs because the fungus grow very. So it is like a broth dilution. So you have to keep the broth in different dilution of the antifungal, whatever, Vori or Ampho. and then usually go for growth. It is not very well validated. It is tried in Apollo Chennai. They have doing it, but I don't know whether they are currently doing it. I don't know
Yes.
which other labs are doing. Maybe few labs in India. PGH Chandigarh, of course, they will do. Not widely done. So we go by ORI. If it is a clinical failure, we take a call. We don't look for sensitivities, susceptibilities for
Yeah.
molds.
Yeah, that's what, ma'am. Actually, this case actually it was very confusing. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to add something over there. Another thing with Gori is once you switch from IV to oral, so very important is to follow the drug levels also. Although
Yes.
very
Yeah.
commonly the
Yeah.
drug levels are available, but cases who are sick like this are usually, they end up in polypharmacy. And voriconazole is one drug which can affect the levels of other drugs and which can be affected by the combination with other drugs as well. So getting to know what the drug level is it in the therapeutic range or not, is very important. We may be giving 400 milligrams of voriconazole, the patient may not be absorbing it, the patient may
Yeah.
not be maintaining enough drug levels. That could be one of the reasons why the drug may not be working, rather than looking at resistance right away.
Exactly.
Yeah, actually, this as well as resistance is some not very common, but I could see some of the Indian studies like like using this pesticides. Actually, that is the reason for most of the azole resistance, and it has been increased so far. Not in medical journals, in other journals I have seen in microbiology journals and all. They told that using pesticides is one of the problem of
So that
this
is
indigenous
common.
resistance. Yeah,
Yeah, it's a Europe. In Europe, they use laws. So azolism is very common in Europe,
yeah,
and azolism is not a major concern here. And as Dr. Jinder said, TDM, actually TDM, therapeutic drug levels is very, very important for post and Gori. You can overshoot, you can underdo. So it's very important that we do it on a weekly basis till a steady state is reached. And proton pump inhibitor use is again, it can interact. So there are so many interactions. When you start Gori, you have to list the drugs the patient is on and adjust every other drug, anti-epileptics, proton pump inhibitor, rifampicin, whatnot, Eptoin, and TAC, so many things, rifampicin. So all this have to be looked at the day of starting the therapy. Very important.
Okay. Fine. Ma'am, I think it's better because we are
Yeah.
logged in
So-
since more than. Yeah.
Yeah.
Please,
Okay.
over to you.
Dr. Jindal, do you want to say anything as a closing remarks? From my side, it's my simplest thanks to Abbott to make this happen. I thoroughly enjoyed both the cases and the session as a whole. And thanks again for arranging this. Thank you so much.
So I would just like to say it was really a lovely session. It was a beautiful meeting. Other than the case, Dr. Rajalakshmi, thank you for that beautiful comprehensive review for hospital infection. And then definitely Mr. Vipul, Dr. Kiranya for providing the technical support, Abbott for making the event possible. Thank you all. And most importantly, thank you to the audience who's been listening to us, even though we have overshot the time by a very, very wide margin, not a narrow margin, but for tolerating us and for being with us throughout the meeting. Thank you all.
Thank you.
yeah. Thank you all. Thank you all for organizing this wonderful webinar. And thanks, Dr. Rajalakshmi madam, for
ma'am, sir.
moderating this session very nicely. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kiran. Yes, tell me.
Yeah.
On behalf of Abbott, I would like to express sincere gratitude and thanks to Dr. A. Rajalakshmi ma'am, Dr. Apar Jindal sir, and Dr. Yuvarajan sir for coming on our platform and taking this discussion in a very fantastic way. I think we all are very much benefited with this. I hope the audience are also feeling the same. And also, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude and thanks to all our audience for coming on our platform and being this for such a long time and enjoying this discussion. So once again, I would like to thank all of you for making this webinar a fruitful success. Thank you so much. Good night. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rajalakshmi. Thank you, Dr. Jindal. Thank you, Dr. Ivan. Thank you, Dr. Kiran.